Hello, everyone, and welcome to a journey into the darkness of the past. Tonight, we will pull back the curtain on an experience both raw and poetic, getting drunk in the medieval world. It was an era where alcohol wasn't a recreational choice, but a matter of survival, safer than the water, more reliable than a doctor's word, and easier to find than God's forgiveness. Before we dive deeper into the story, I'd love to know where on earth you're exploring with me from, and what time your clock is showing. It's wonderful to know we're connecting from all over. Now, join me in dimming the lights, listen to the soft sounds around you, and let us begin our journey back in time. The medieval buzz, when beer and wine were the water of life, faith, and society. In our modern imagination, the Middle Ages often conjure images of knights in shining armor, imposing stone castles, and bloody battles. But hidden behind these heroic tapestries lies a much grittier, harsher reality, a world where the most basic necessities of daily life were a constant struggle. And in that struggle, no element was more common, more important, or more multifaceted than alcohol. For the people of the Middle Ages, alcoholic beverages were not merely a means of escapism or a luxurious indulgence. They were the very water of life, a medicine more reliable than medicine itself, an essential source of calories, a social lubricant, and even a path closer to God. To truly understand this era, we must set aside our modern prejudices about intoxication and see beer and wine through their eyes, as an indispensable pillar in a world fraught with uncertainty. Imagine you are a 13th century peasant in Europe. Your day begins before sunrise and ends long after the last light has faded. You toil in the fields, your back aching, your body caked in mud, and your throat parched with thirst. But instead of reaching for a cool ladle of water, you do something your modern descendants would find deeply alarming. You reach for a large tankard of ale. This act isn't about seeking a gentle buzz after a day of labor. It is an act of instinctual self-preservation. Simply put, drinking the water could kill you. Medieval people had a healthy and entirely justified paranoia about untreated water. Rivers, wells, and springs were not the pristine streams we might imagine. They were society's convenient dumping grounds. Everything from human and animal waste, dead livestock, household trash, to the corpse of some unlucky traveler was tipped straight into the water supply. Germ theory did not yet exist, but through centuries of painful trial and error, people had learned a harsh truth. Drinking straight from the stream was the quickest way to spend a night with your face in a bucket or, worse, in a shallow grave. The solution to this life-or-death problem was small beer. This was a low-alcohol beverage, only about 1 to 2% ABV, fermented simply from available grains like barley, oats, and whatever wild yeast happened to be floating in the air. The fermentation process, even a mild one, was enough to kill most of the harmful bacteria in the water, turning a dangerous liquid into a safe one. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't strong, but it was safer than the plague-ridden puddle outside your door. For this reason, everyone drank beer. Children drank it, nuns in their convents drank it, and, of course, monks drank it. The average consumption for a medieval person was about a gallon, roughly 3.7 liters, of ale per day. This figure sounds staggering, but it doesn't mean they were all stumbling alcoholics. They drank beer because they simply did not trust the water. Furthermore, in many places, especially Northern Europe where grapes couldn't thrive, beer wasn't just a drink. It was considered a food group. It was a calorie delivery system in a cup, a form of liquid bread. In a world where food was scarce and the local miller's bread was often hard and moldy, an energy-rich flagon of ale was a precious, and far more palatable, dietary supplement. Of course, with such a low alcohol content, people weren't lurching around drunk all day. But if you drank too much, especially on an empty stomach, things could certainly get wobbly. While the peasants were chugging small beer to avoid a diseased death, a sophisticated brewing revolution was quietly taking place inside the monasteries. Between hours of prayer, scripture copying, and perhaps moments of regret over their vows of celibacy, monks quietly became Europe's first master brewers. Why monks? The answer lies in their circumstances. Monasteries were clean, relatively stable, and, most importantly, filled with literate men who had time on their hands and access to very large pots. Brewing became as integral to the monastic routine as prayer, fasting, and silently judging each other's handwriting. They brewed to serve visiting pilgrims, for charity, and, of course, for themselves. Unlike the peasant who simply tossed grain in a pot and hoped for the best, monks approached brewing scientifically. They recorded everything, measuring ingredients precisely, timing fermentation, and experimenting with new recipes. One of their most significant contributions was the introduction of hops. This plant not only added the characteristic bitter flavor to beer, balancing the sweetness of the malt, but it also acted as a natural preservative, allowing the beer to last longer. A brilliant theological loophole also helped advance the art of monastic brewing. During periods of strict fasting, monks were forbidden from eating solid food, but liquids were permitted. This gave birth to what they affectionately called liquid bread, stronger, denser, more flavorful, and calorie-rich beers. It had enough energy, enough taste, and enough alcohol to get a man living within four walls through the lean days of penance. Some monasteries became famous throughout their regions for the quality of their beer. Townspeople came to the abbey not just for spiritual enlightenment, but to buy superior ale. By the 14th century, many abbeys were running what we would today call craft breweries. Only the brewmaster wasn't a guy named Chad in a flannel shirt, but Brother Gregory with a tonsure and perfectly kept fermentation logs. Monastic beer became a brand, and to this day, many famous beer labels around the world still bear the names of ancient religious orders, a testament to the fact that holy men truly understood the sacred relationship between man and his ale. Long before social media, before you could ruin your reputation with a single tweet, there was the tavern. And in the Middle Ages, the tavern was where everything happened. Marriages were planned there, business deals were sealed there, brawls broke out there. And of course, people got gloriously, magnificently, and sometimes apocalyptically drunk there. The tavern was the medieval answer to both the office and the public square. You went there for news, to gossip about your neighbors, to argue about taxes, and to occasionally find out if someone had just been excommunicated. It was basically a medieval Reddit forum, only with more ale and probably slightly fewer trolls. The interior was simple, a floor of dirt or straw, rough-hewn wooden benches, an open hearth, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have washed the cups this week. The air was thick with smoke, garlic, and regret. On a busy night, you might find traveling minstrels, a noisy game of dice, or even a spontaneous pig auction happening between rounds. The drink menu was humble, usually just ale, maybe some cider, and if you were lucky or rich, a bit of wine. But no one came for the variety. They came for the chaos. In a society where most people labored from dawn till dusk, a tavern was more than a place to drink. It was a pressure release valve, a place where the stresses and strains of life were let loose. It was also where social boundaries were temporarily erased. In the tavern, a peasant could rub shoulders with a merchant, and a cleric might share a bench with the town blacksmith. All were equal under the ale, until someone spilled a flagon, and then the chaos would begin. Of course, not everyone loved the taverns. Church leaders complained they were dens of sin, and town councils tried to regulate them with about as much success as regulating the pigeon population. But the simple truth was this: the tavern was essential. It kept the community connected, it let people blow off steam, and it gave them a place to lose arguments, money, and their memory, all in one night. In medieval Europe, how drunk you got and how much dignity you lost in the process often depended on your social status. Intoxication was not a uniform experience. It was distinctly stratified, like an unstable, multi-tiered wedding cake. Let's start at the bottom, the peasant. The average village laborer drank small beer or weak cider throughout the day, not to party, but to survive. It was a source of calories, a replacement for water, and frankly, one of the few affordable pleasures in a life of calluses and taxes. Peasants drank from wooden mugs, clay jugs, or, if things were truly desperate, their own cupped hands. Getting drunk wasn't always the goal, but on feast days, you could be sure someone was waking up in a haystack with no memory and someone else's shoes. Now let's climb the muddy social ladder to the nobility. Here, drink was about status. Nobles drank wine, ideally imported, absurdly expensive, and served in precious metal goblets that could double as a helmet. The wine was often sweetened, spiced, or perfumed, because nothing says power like drinking something that smells like your grandmother's closet. Noble court feasts were liquid marathons. Multiple courses, endless pours of wine, and toasts so long you could grow a beard in the middle of one. Getting drunk at court was common, even expected, but it had to be done with grace. Slurring in Latin and getting wine on your tunic was forgivable. Vomiting on the bishop's vestments was a bit of a faux pas. Finally, there were the monks and clergy, who floated in their own sanctified bubble. They were technically celibate and, occasionally, sober. Monasteries brewed beer, but priests drank wine, for sacramental purposes, of course, which was a polite way of saying they were often pleasantly buzzed by vespers. But whether peasant or noble, there was one universal rule: don't waste it. Alcohol was valuable. Every drop was grown, fermented, stored, and transported by someone. You drank what you had, and you respected it. Drink was the great medieval equalizer. It dulled the misery of the poor and inflated the ego of the rich. Everyone got something out of it. Some got a buzz, others got a story. So what exactly were medieval people drinking when they wanted to unwind, or simply survive another day of plague, plowing, or paying taxes? Their menu, while not as diverse as today's, held some interesting surprises. Ale, the true backbone of the medieval beverage industry. It was unfiltered, uncarbonated, and often thick enough to be chewed. Ale came in various strengths: small beer, regular ale, which was enough to cause a pleasant buzz, and strong ale that could make you see angels. Mead, the drink for people who wanted to feel a bit mythological. Made from fermented honey and water, it was sweet, strong, and popular at feasts. If ale was the village plumber, mead was the traveling bard with a lute and a questionable glint in his eye. Wine, primarily for the rich, the clergy, and anyone living in southern Europe. But medieval wine was a far cry from your modern Merlot. It was often sour, weak, and frequently doctored with herbs, spices, or even seawater. Yes, seawater. Cider and perry, popular in regions with plenty of orchards. Sweet, slightly fizzy, and dangerously easy to overconsume. The other weird stuff. Sometimes, the menu got truly strange. There was bracket, a beer mead hybrid often strong enough to strip paint. There was posset, a bizarre hot concoction of curdled milk and ale that looked like a frothy soup made by someone angry at a cow. Occasionally, medicinal drinks entered the mix. Herbal wines that promised to cure everything from headaches to demonic possession. And finally, for the truly brave, there was ale mixed with a raw egg, a supposed strength booster that was a guaranteed nausea inducer. If you thought beer pong was the height of human civilization, let me introduce you to the chaotic world of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were high, the rules were vague, and the chance of injury hovered around absolutely. Getting drunk wasn't just a side effect of medieval socializing. It was the main event, and games helped speed things along. These weren't structured competitions with scorecards. No, these were activities that began with laughter and ended with someone passed out in a turnip barrel. Toasting wars. Two or more people would try to out-toast each other, not with clever words, but with sheer volume. It was less about poetry and more about surviving each round without slurring. Casting the dice, often played for drinks, coins, or questionable favors. The dice were crude, often carved from bone, and the rules changed depending on who was sober enough to explain them. If the game ended with an accusation of cheating, congratulations, you've just invented a tavern brawl. Who can drink the most, the fastest? An uncreative but immensely popular title. This game was less about winning and more about earning bragging rights and possible liver failure. Physical games. Once the drink took hold, the physical games began. Balancing contests, spinning challenges, and impromptu wrestling matches that started after someone mistook the minstrel for a goblin. The point of these games was never really to win. The point was to drink more, laugh louder, and test the structural integrity of the local furniture. As we look back from the 21st century, it's easy to judge the drinking habits of the Middle Ages as excessive or primitive. But to do so is to ignore the complex context that shaped them. In a world without modern water filtration, without antibiotics, and with few available pleasures, alcohol was not a choice. It was a necessity. It was a shield against disease, a liquid source of nutrition, a social currency, and the catalyst for community bonding. From the peasant's small beer to the lord's spiced wine, From the monk's carefully recorded recipe to the boisterous laughter of the tavern, alcohol was woven into every aspect of medieval life. It quelled rebellions, soothed the pains of labor, and lit sparks of joy in the darkest of times. Its legacy remains, not just in the monastic beer brands we enjoy today, but in the very concept of a public house where people can gather, share, and for a little while, forget their burdens. The Middle Ages may be over, but the memory of an era when alcohol was everything, life, society, faith, still echoes, a reminder that humanity's relationship with the fermented grape and grain is as complex and as old as civilization itself. Ancient love magic, when love was domination, obsession, and a curse. Love, in our modern world, is often pictured through romantic poetry, bouquets of roses, and tender gestures. It's an emotion celebrated for its free will and soulful connection. But if we turn back the wheel of time to the ancient civilizations of Babylon, Greece, Rome, and Egypt, we step into a completely different world. There, love was not always a feeling to be cultivated. It was often a battlefield, a conquest. When charm and words failed, magic took over. Ancient love spells were not innocent incantations hoping for a glance. They were powerful tools, complex rituals designed not to inspire affection, but to dominate, obsess, and bend the will of another. This was a world where the line between desire and a curse grew thin, where love was summoned with blood, bone, ashes, and whispers to dark gods. To understand ancient love magic, we must shed our romantic lens and look it squarely in the face. A brutal psychological war where love was not found, but taken. Babylonian love spells, conquest by clay and curses. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the mud-brick cities of Babylon, love was not a random occurrence. It was a campaign, and like any war, it required strategy, incantations, and occasionally, the help of a very cranky demon. Babylonian love magic did not shy away from meddling with the supernatural. If you couldn't win someone's affection with charm, you wrote their name on a cursed clay effigy and buried it near their door. Advantage, you. Who needs roses when you have necromancy? The Babylonians believed love could be summoned or subdued through ritual and invocation. Clay tablets unearthed from Mesopotamian archives describe incantations where a priest or sorceress would call upon Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, to bend a target's will. And Ishtar wasn't the gentle, harp-playing type of goddess. She once destroyed an entire mountain range because someone rejected her. So, she definitely knew a thing or two about vengeance and passion. The spells often included personal items like hair, fingernails, or a few drops of blood. These organic tokens were believed to bind the lover's spirit to the spellcaster. They would be burned in small fires, dissolved into scented oils, or wrapped in cloth pouches. These pouches would then be buried under a threshold or hidden in a bed to warm the heart of the desired person. This warming, however, could sometimes cause obsession or madness. But hey, what love doesn't come with a few side effects? And it wasn't all about attraction. Babylonian texts also speak of apotropaic charms, designed to drive away unwanted suitors or nullify a rival's erotic appeal. In one particularly nasty spell, a woman asked the gods to make her rival's breath smell like a corpse. Subtle, effective, and guaranteed to ruin any moonlit romantic moment. This blend of carnal desire and divine manipulation created a culture where love was a battlefield, layered with ash, honey, blood, and whispers. You didn't just hope someone would love you. You pulled them into a cosmic tug-of-war, using scrolls, effigies, and unseen spirits to tip the scales. Love in Babylon was rarely consensual. It was an act of will. And when words failed, the spell stepped in, carved in cuneiform, whispered to the stars, and sealed with sacred smoke. Babylonian love wasn't pure, but it was incredibly powerful. Greek love spells, erotic madness, and binding charms. If the Babylonians saw love as a conquest, the Greeks turned it into a frenzied obsession. They had a specific name for this magical obsession, eros. But this wasn't the gentle affection you'd write a sonnet about. This was a maddening, scorching, all-consuming fire that was more likely to send someone to a temple begging for mercy than strolling hand in hand through the olive groves. Greek love magic was split into two powerful branches, agoge spells and philia spells. Agoge, leading spells. These charms were meant to lead someone, sometimes quite literally, to the practitioner. Often used by men, these spells aim to ignite lust, induce sleeplessness, and even make the victim hallucinate until they surrendered to desire. A typical agoge spell might say something like, "Burn her heart until she comes crawling to me." Yes, crawling. The Greeks were not subtle about their intentions. The spells were often written on thin lead tablets, cheap, durable, and symbolically heavy, and buried in graveyards or wells, places seen as gateways to the underworld. Why? Because these spells often invoked underworld spirits or restless ghosts to do the dirty work. You wanted someone to love you? You'd call on a dead person with nothing better to do. Philia, affection spells on the other hand. Philia spells were more about affection management. They were often used by women to maintain peace in a marriage or control a husband's wandering eye. Instead of summoning a burning passion, philia charms focused on harmony and loyalty. They were sometimes infused into wine or oil, acting as magical sedatives hidden in daily rituals. Of course, herbs and potions played a major role. The Greeks used aphrodisiacs like mandrake root, a plant vaguely shaped like a human that was said to scream when pulled from the ground, probably not ideal first-date material. Love potions also included honey, myrrh, and even crushed bones, mixed into drinks or rubbed on clothing. One particularly potent formula involved menstrual blood, an intimate and powerful ingredient believed to bind a man's soul to his lover forever. Greek erotic magic was not romantic in the modern sense. It was strategic, visceral, and often aimed at control rather than consensus. Eros, the god of love, was often depicted blindfolded and armed with a bow and arrow for a reason. Love wasn't just blind, it was dangerous, and the Greeks knew exactly how to weaponize it. Roman love magic, legal loopholes, and poison perfume. When it came to love, the Romans took what the Greeks started and added more wine, more drama, and more legal loopholes. Roman love spells weren't just folk traditions whispered by lonely hearts. They were considered tools of influence, status preservation, and sometimes outright revenge. The most common form of Roman love magic was the depictions, binding curses. Like the Greeks, they inscribed them on thin lead tablets, but their content was often more commanding and theatrical. These tablets were folded like cursed love letters before being buried in graves or thrown into rivers. The idea was to imprison the target's mind, body, and spirit by calling on underworld gods like Pluto or Hecate. Some curses read like court summons, others like deranged fan fiction. One particularly chilling example from Rome asks for a woman named Victrix to burn with love for me, Marcus, like a torch, day and night, until she can no longer bear it without me. It sounds romantic until you realize Marcus buried that spell next to the grave of a child for extra power. Roman ethics, apparently, were optional. Perfumes and scented oils were another avenue for magical manipulation. Women would anoint themselves or their intended lovers with mixtures infused with herbs like vervain, mint, or even belladonna, which could sedate or excite depending on the dosage. A sweet-smelling woman might not just be trying to impress. She could be silently slipping you a love potion in liquid form. A particularly infamous Roman tactic was the so-called Venus's wine, a potent love potion rumored to contain animal parts, exotic herbs, and bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were rumored to have slipped it into their masters' cups to shift the balance of power. If the potion didn't work, at least the intoxication might stir up a little vulnerability. Interestingly, Roman law acknowledged love magic, but not as a crime of passion. Instead, it was classified with witchcraft and seen as a public menace if it disrupted property rights or inheritance. Love was all fun and games until someone cursed a senator to become a bachelor. For the Romans, love was political, magical, and occasionally toxic, just the way they liked it. Egyptian love magic, divine seduction, and dream charms. In ancient Egypt, love was sacred, mystical, and dangerous in the hands of the wrong priest. Egyptian love spells combined religious devotion, poetic metaphor, and when necessary, ruthless manipulation. These weren't the ramblings of a lovesick teenager. They were carefully composed rituals, often recorded on papyrus and backed by the power of deities like Hathor, Isis, and Bes. A popular technique was the dream charm. In it, the spellcaster would summon a god or demon to appear in the desired person's dreams. The dream would whisper things like, "You long for her as the desert longs for rain." Elegant, yes. Manipulative, absolutely. A restored papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes a spell where the target's heart is likened to a captive bird, fluttering restlessly unless reunited with the spellcaster. These texts were often written in red ink, considered magically potent, and sometimes included thumbnail sketches of bound figures or birds with clipped wings. Physical objects held power, too. Wax effigies were used to represent both the spellcaster and the target. These dolls were anointed with perfumes, pierced with needles, or placed in jars inscribed with love formulas. Depending on the goal, passion, or punishment, the results would vary. Want affection? Rub the doll with lotus oil. Want revenge for a rejection? Add scorpion venom. Potions were also common, often involving ingredients like honey, wine, mandrake root, and, not surprisingly, blood. Some spells even called for menstrual blood mixed with beer, believed to bind a man's soul to a woman through their shared essence. What truly set Egyptian love magic apart was its divine undertone. These were not mere tricks, they were prayers. Love and desire were seen as natural extensions of the divine will, but the divine will could be influenced with the right hymns, the right words, and a properly charged amulet. The grimoire of taboo ingredients. In ancient love magic, ingredients were not chosen for their scent or taste. They were chosen for their symbolic and spiritual potency. The more powerful and taboo the item, the more power it was believed to hold. Personal items, hair, fingernails, saliva, and menstrual blood were commonly used because they contained a person's essence. To bind someone, you needed a piece of them, or a piece of yourself. Animal ingredients. Babylonian spells sometimes called for scraps of lion skin, crocodile fat, or the feathers of nocturnal birds, creatures believed to live between worlds. In Egypt, scorpion venom could be applied to amulets or mixed with myrrh to stir both desire and fear. Remains of the dead. Some formulas went far beyond the personal. In Rome, spells sometimes included the ashes of burnt bones or, more disturbingly, the remains of convicted criminals. If love couldn't be won, it would be stolen from the world of the dead. Hallucinogenic herbs and poisons. Many potions blurred the line between aphrodisiac and poison. Belladonna, mandrake, and henbane were all popular ingredients. In the right dose, they induced feelings of euphoria and emotional openness. In the wrong dose, love became eternal in the tombstone sense. When love spells were curses in disguise. Not all ancient love charms were meant to spark passion. Some were thinly veiled curses, wrapped in seductive language but filled with venom. They weren't about mutual desire. They were about domination, humiliation, or revenge. Many so-called love spells in Greece and Rome were actually binding curses, depictions, aimed at overwhelming the victim's will. The idea was to shatter a person's emotional independence, leaving them sleepless, obsessed, and emotionally enslaved. It was truly psychological warfare. These spells often targeted the mind and body. A common Greek curse would ask the underworld gods to bind the target's hands, feet, tongue, and even their genitals, rendering them helpless unless they came crawling back to the spellcaster. Sometimes, these love curses included a second victim, a rival. In that case, the spell would redirect all of the target's passion to the practitioner while simultaneously destroying the rival's chances. One spell from Carthage cursed a woman's rival with hair loss, a rotting voice, and a diseased womb, a terrifying way to ensure she wouldn't be the object of anyone's desire. The enduring echo of ancient love magic. Though the gods of Babylon have long fallen silent and the lead tablets of Rome have crumbled, the heartbeat of ancient love magic never truly stopped. It simply adapted. The spells, potions, and rituals of the ancient world evolved, repackaged into folk traditions, superstitions, and even the self-help rituals we still see today. The concept of the love potion persists, whether in the form of herbal teas or essential oils promising to enhance attraction. Folk traditions in southern Italy still echo Roman and Greek rituals with red ribbons and herb pouches. Even in popular culture, the image of the bewitched lover remains a favorite trope, reflecting the ancient warning that passion summoned by force is likely to dissolve into chaos. Today, love spells are still sold online, though branded with pastel colors and witchy aesthetics. Ultimately, ancient love magic wasn't just about making someone love you. It was about reclaiming control in the face of desire. That impulse, timeless, desperate, and beautifully human, is still with us. We are still chasing that same alchemy, to be seen, to be desired, to be chosen. And if a little magic can help along the way, then so be it. Ancient arenas, when sport was ritual, warfare, and the fate of empires. In the modern world, sport is a familiar part of life. We watch it for entertainment, participate in it for health, and celebrate its victories as achievements of talent and hard work. But if we peel back the layers of commercialization and mere amusement, we find that the DNA of every match, every race today is encoded from a much older and more profound past. For the ancient civilizations, sport was not a pastime. It was a sacred duty, a performance of flesh and will before the gods, a form of unarmed warfare, a cosmic drama, and an essential tool for building and maintaining empires. From the naked athletes of Olympia to the blood-soaked gladiators of Rome, from the life-or-death ball games of Mesoamerica to the philosophical archery contests of China, ancient sport was a mirror reflecting the soul of a culture. It was where ambition, faith, violence, and honor collided, creating immortal legends and shaping a legacy we still inherit to this day. Greece, the sacred contest. In ancient Greece, sport wasn't just sport, it was a ritual. And nowhere was this more apparent than the Olympic Games. First held in 776 BCE at Olympia, a sacred sanctuary dedicated to the god Zeus. For over 1,000 years, every 4 years, Greeks from across the city-states would set aside political conflicts and wars to come together in pursuit of immortality through muscle and courage. Participating in the Olympics was a great honor, requiring months, even years, of preparation under the strict supervision of coaches, priests, and even philosophers. Before competing, athletes had to take a solemn oath before a statue of Zeus, promising they had prepared honestly and would not cheat. This was no mere formality. Violating the oath could lead to a public flogging or a humiliating disqualification. Honor was everything. And if you're picturing chariot races or discus throws with dignified robes flowing in the wind, stop. Greek athletes competed completely nude. This was a tribute to the beauty of the male form, but more importantly, it was a sign of transparency. There was nothing to hide, no armor, no tricks, just pure athletic ability and the judgment of the gods from above. The initial events were simple: running, long jump, discus, javelin, wrestling, and boxing. But then came the pancration, a brutal combination of wrestling and boxing with extremely few rules. Fingers were broken, eyes were gouged, and the crowd roared its approval. Death was not common, but it was not forbidden either. In the world of the pancration, victory at all costs was the ultimate goal. Winning brought more than just bragging rights. The victor was awarded a simple laurel wreath made from an olive branch, but they returned to their hometowns as heroes. Some cities rewarded winners with free meals for life, front row seats at the theater, or even tax exemptions. Poets would immortalize their names, and sculptors might carve their likeness into marble. For a fleeting moment, they became godlike. However, this world had no place for women. They were not allowed in the stands, and certainly not allowed to compete. The Olympic Games were exclusively male. Although women had their own festival, the Hurriye, also held at Olympia with foot races for unmarried girls, it paled in comparison to the testosterone-fueled spectacle that defined the men's arena. For the Greeks, the Olympics were more than a game. They were a sacred fire fueled by ambition, discipline, and divine expectation. Rome, the bloody spectacle. If the Greeks turned sport into a sacred ritual, the Romans transformed it into a bloody spectacle. In the Roman Empire, athletics was synonymous with violence, and no event embodied this more than the gladiatorial games. These were not polite contests. They were brutal displays of life and death, designed to stimulate the masses, honor the dead, and remind everyone who held the power. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. But despite their low status, many became household names, like Spartacus, who rose to become a legend, admired even as he was sent to fight for the crowd's pleasure. Trained in special schools called ludi, these men, and sometimes women, were taught to fight with discipline, precision, and style. The more dramatic, the better. Bloodshed was part of the entertainment. The most famous arena was, of course, the Colosseum, an engineering marvel that could hold up to 50,000 spectators. The events were completely free, sponsored by emperors and politicians eager to win public favor. They called it bread and circuses. Keep the populace fed and entertained, and they won't ask too many questions about corruption or conquest. The fighting styles were diverse. Some gladiators, like the secutor, fought with a sword and shield, while others, like the retiarius, used a net and trident. Each type had its own strengths, weaknesses, and costumes, carefully arranged to keep the matches unpredictable and exciting. The games weren't just gladiator versus gladiator. There were mock naval battles, wild animal hunts, and public executions. It was a mix of athletics, theater, and horror. However, contrary to popular belief, not every match ended in death. Most fights concluded when one warrior surrendered. Killing a well-trained gladiator was a bad business move. They were investments. Only the editor, the sponsor of the games, had the power to decide whether a loser lived or died. And yes, the infamous thumbs up or down gesture is likely a myth embellished by Hollywood. Despite their bloody purpose, some gladiators achieved celebrity status. They received gifts, fan mail. Ancient graffiti has been found praising their nice thighs, and sometimes their freedom. For the Romans, sport was not a celebration of the human body, but a celebration of the empire's power, a reminder that even life and death were just entertainment under their control. Mesoamerica, the cosmic ball game. Long before soccer or basketball, the peoples of Mesoamerica played a game that was a blend of sport, religious drama, and a cosmic parable. Known today as the Mesoamerican ball game, or by its Nahuatl name Alamalisli, this was not a weekend recreational activity. It was a sacred ritual, a political tool, and sometimes a death sentence. Played by the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec, the game involved a solid, heavy rubber ball, sometimes weighing up to 4 kilograms, which players had to keep in motion using only their hips, elbows, knees, or thighs. No hands. The goal varied by region and era, but in many cases, it involved hitting the ball through a vertical stone hoop mounted high on the court wall. Given the size of the ball and the limited body parts allowed, scoring a point was a monumental feat. The courts, called tlaklai or paktapak, were shaped like a capital I, with sloped sides, often surrounded by carvings depicting gods, warriors, and scenes of sacrifice. These were not your average playing fields. They were stages where gods and mortals collided. The ball game was deeply symbolic. It represented the eternal battle between life and death, day and night, the gods and the underworld. In some versions of the myth, the game reenacted the journey of the hero twins from the Mayan Popol Vuh, who descended into the underworld and played ball against the lords of death themselves. The most controversial element is ritual sacrifice. Contrary to popular myth, not all games ended in death, but many important matches, especially those tied to religious festivals, did. The victim was not always the loser. In some elite contexts, the captain of the winning team was offered as a noble tribute to the gods, theoretically to gain divine favor through death. Others argue it was the losers who paid the price. What is undeniable is the cultural weight of the game. It wasn't just entertainment, it was theology in motion. The thud of the rubber ball echoed through temple plazas, a heartbeat of belief, identity, and power. Egypt and China, the philosophical pursuit. Not all ancient civilizations viewed sport as violence or a life-and-death ritual. In Egypt and China, physical activities were woven tightly into philosophy, cosmic order, and the art of statecraft. In Egypt, sport was a reflection of Ma'at, cosmic order, balance, and justice. Wrestling is perhaps the most visually documented sport, with tomb paintings over 4,000 years old showing pairs of young men executing complex holds and throws. Archery was another vital sport, especially for the pharaohs. Depictions of rulers firing arrows from chariots were not just records of skill, but a form of political propaganda. A strong pharaoh was a divinely approved one. Boat races on the Nile were also ritualistic, reenacting the mythical journeys of the gods. In ancient China, sport was woven into the fabric of Confucian values, military training, and the pursuit of harmony between mind and body. Archery was considered a noble art. Competitions were held in ceremonial halls where ritual was as important as accuracy. Hitting the target was seen as a metaphor for achieving moral perfection. The sport of polo, known as jiu-jitsu, became the sport of emperors and aristocrats, thrilling and dangerous. Remarkably, noble women also participated, galloping alongside men in an era of otherwise rigid gender roles. Kuju, an early form of soccer, was initially developed to train soldiers. Even intellectual games like Go and chess were seen as mental sports, testing strategy and emotional control. Women in the ancient arena. Though often overlooked in historical records, women in the ancient world did participate in sports, though often under strict limitations. As mentioned, Greek women were barred from the Olympics, but had their own Herae festival. In Sparta, however, women enjoyed far more athletic freedom. Spartan girls were publicly trained in running, wrestling, and discus throwing, often competing before male audiences. Their physical strength was seen as a civic virtue. Strong mothers produced strong warriors. In Egypt, tomb paintings show women dancing and performing gymnastic feats, especially during festivals. In Rome, lower-class women and slaves sometimes performed in the arenas as gladiatrices, female gladiators. And perhaps most notably, in Tang Dynasty China, noble women played polo, one of the few major sports that allowed men and women to compete alongside each other. Though their roles were limited, the existence of these female athletes reveals a more complex and diverse story than is often told. The echo in the modern world. Though the crowds have dispersed and the dust of the ancient stadiums has long since settled, the spirit of ancient sports still vibrates in the modern world. The Olympic Games themselves are a direct revival, modeled on their Greek ancestor. The Roman influence echoes in our love for stadium sports, massive arenas, and the theatricality of modern matches. The Mesoamerican tradition resonates in the way we imbue sports with ritual and symbolism, speaking of athletes as warriors and games as battles. From the Chinese idea of sport as a moral education to the military discipline of the Persians, the legacy is undeniable. The ancient world didn't just invent games. They invented the idea that through sport, humanity could aspire to greatness. Not just of strength or speed, but of honor, meaning, and the eternal pursuit of something just beyond our reach. When we watch a modern athlete break a world record, we are witnessing the latest echo of an ancient tradition, the unending human quest to become godlike, if only for a moment. The Paris Catacombs, the empire of the dead beneath the city of light. Paris, a name that evokes images of romance, art, and brilliant lights. It is the city of the Eiffel Tower, of elegant boulevards, of sidewalk cafes, and of museums filled with masterpieces. But beneath that glamorous surface, another Paris exists. A city of darkness, of endless silence, a world woven from tunnels carved deep into the limestone and lined from floor to ceiling with human bones. This is the Catacombs, an underground empire stretching over 300 kilometers, the final resting place of more than 6 million souls. To truly understand Paris, one cannot just look up at its spires. They must dare to look down into the abyss of history, where death is not an end, but an architecture. From public health crisis to mass grave, the story of the Catacombs does not begin as a work of art or a tourist attraction. It begins with a horrifying public health crisis. By the mid-18th century, Paris was facing a critical problem. The city had run out of space, not for the living, but for the dead. The city's cemeteries, which had been in use for centuries, were overflowing to the point of literal collapse. The most famous and infamous was the Saints' Innocents Cemetery, Cimetière des Innocents, located right in the city center. Used for nearly 1,000 years, It had accumulated centuries of corpses, layer upon layer in mass graves, often 6 or 7 bodies deep. As Paris's population grew, the problem worsened. Saints' Innocents and other cemeteries had become bubbling pits of decomposition. The stench was inescapable, seeping into nearby homes, churches, and markets. Nearby residents complained of the unbearable odor and constant illness. Meat in shops spoiled faster, and drinking water tasted strange. In some accounts, the basement walls of nearby houses began to crack and ooze human remains. It wasn't just disgusting, it was extremely dangerous. In 1763, King Louis XV issued a royal edict banning burials within the city, but the church resisted. For them, cemeteries were holy ground, and bodies must rest in consecrated soil. But by the 1780s, the situation reached a breaking point. After a cellar wall collapsed under the weight of decaying bodies on the other side, public health officials demanded a drastic solution. The dead could no longer stay above ground. This is where the abandoned limestone quarries entered the story. These underground tunnels, remnants of Paris's building boom, were largely unused, dark, cold, and far from the city's site. They were the perfect place for a mass exhumation. The Great Transfer, a procession of bones. In 1786, the authorities began one of the most macabre logistical projects in history, moving the bones from the Saints' Innocents Cemetery to the network of tunnels. The work was carried out at night, to avoid public attention and to show a measure of respect. Imagine the scene. Under the flickering light of torches, workers in long cloaks silently unearthed the mass graves. The bones were loaded onto carts, covered with black cloth. Priests accompanied the procession, chanting prayers for the dead. It was a process both horrifying and solemn. The carts of bones traveled through the quiet streets of Paris, entered an entrance to the quarries, and tipped their cargo into the darkness below. The transfer of remains lasted for decades. After Saints' Innocents, other overflowing cemeteries were cleared in turn. As more and more bones filled the tunnels, they were initially just piled up. But soon, a new vision emerged. The crisis born of too many dead and too little land had inadvertently created one of the world's most chilling monuments, a reminder that even in death, the city must be managed. The architecture of the dead. Entering the ossuary of the catacombs, a visitor immediately realizes this is not a random pile of bones. This is architecture. A cold, meticulous symmetry, crafted not from stone or brick, but from human remains themselves. This transformation did not happen by accident. It was the work of Louis-Étienne Héricart de Thury, the Inspector General of the quarries in the early 19th century. While previous transfers had simply dumped the bones in heaps, Héricart had a different vision. He believed the catacombs could serve as a moral and aesthetic monument, both a solution to overflowing cemeteries and a meditation on the transience of life. Under his direction, the ossuary was cleared, organized, and arranged into the haunting gallery we see today. Femurs and tibias were carefully stacked to form solid walls. Thousands of skulls were set in between, creating gruesome decorative bands. Some areas were even arranged into symbolic shapes: hearts, crosses, circular pillars. It is a form of subterranean art, both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Anonymity is a dominant theme. 6 million bodies are reduced to identical skeletons. There are no names, no tombstones, just bones stacked upon bone, arranged like a library of the dead. The only identifying marks are small stone plaques, indicating which cemetery the bones came from and the year they were moved. Interspersed among the walls of bone are inscriptions carved into the stone, adding to the contemplative atmosphere. One of the most famous warns, "Arrête, c'est ici l'empire de la mort." Stop. This is the empire of death. Other quotes are drawn from the Bible or Latin maxims on the vanity of life and the certainty of death. The catacombs were not just a solution. They became a space designed to humble the living and give a silent voice to the countless departed. Who are the dead? The great equalizer. Standing amidst these walls of bone, a haunting question arises. Who were they? The answer is both simple and profound. They were everyone. The catacombs contained the remains of ordinary Parisians who lived and died over centuries. Bakers, servants, priests, midwives, soldiers, children. People who once crowded the city's narrow streets, walked its muddy roads, and worshipped in its churches. When their graves overflowed and the cemeteries began to rot, they were moved here, becoming part of this great ossuary. Some skeletons belonged to victims of plagues, particularly the Black Death and later cholera. Disease killed so many that the cemeteries became mass graves. Others died in famines, fires, or during childbirth. But not all the dead were commoners. The bones of aristocrats, clergy, and French revolutionaries also found their way here. During the French Revolution, in particular, when the guillotine turned public squares into rivers of blood, the victims were often thrown into mass graves and later moved underground. Some believe the remains of key revolutionaries like Danton, Robespierre, or Camille Desmoulins were moved to the catacombs, but no official records confirm their exact location. Down here, titles and ranks disappear. The catacombs are the ultimate equalizer. In death, all are equal. Peasant, poet, plague victim, or patriot all lie side by side, skull next to skull. The anonymity is overwhelming and profound, a reminder that the city of Paris is built, quite literally, on the foundation of countless past lives. The cataphiles, explorers of the Forbidden City. While tourists file through the official section of the catacombs, about a mile of sanitized and well-lit tunnels, beneath their feet, a forbidden world exists. A shadow network of unexplored tunnels, locked gates, and centuries-old passages, riddled with graffiti, hidden rooms, and the occasional underground rave. Welcome to the domain of the cataphiles. Cataphiles are urban explorers who defy city law to access the forbidden zones of the Paris catacombs. They use secret entrances, manholes in parks, storm drains, or trapdoors in cellars. Once inside, they navigate by memory, hand-drawn maps, or intuition. There are no signs, no safety rails, and no cell service. Just the sound of your own footsteps echoing in the dark. This is not just thrill-seeking. For many cataphiles, the catacombs are a second city, a sacred space of history, rebellion, and creativity. For decades, they have created rooms within the tunnels, makeshift libraries, art galleries, and even movie theaters. Some organize secret parties deep underground, with generators, speakers, and candlelight illuminating a dance floor built on stacked skeletons. The cataphile community is tight-knit and fiercely protective. Entry is often by invitation only. Newcomers are tested for their respect and survival skills. The golden rule: never disturb the bones, never graffiti sacred sites, and never get caught. Because all of this is illegal. In 1955, French authorities outlawed all unofficial exploration in the catacombs. The risks are real. The tunnels are unstable and prone to collapse. Some are flooded. Others are filled with narrow passages and dead ends that can disorient even the experienced. Despite the dangers, the city's special police force, the Catacombs, struggle to prevent entry. The system is simply too vast. Every time an entrance is sealed, a new one is found. For the cataphiles, the catacombs are more than bones. They are freedom, mystery, a place where Paris breathes differently. The catacombs at war and in myth. During times of war, the Paris catacombs were not just a macabre curiosity. They became a battlefield in the dark. During World War II, when the Nazis occupied Paris, the catacombs entered a new chapter of intrigue. The Wehrmacht and SS mapped out sections of the catacombs for military use. In one notorious case, a bunker was built directly inside the tunnel system, serving as a command post. But the French resistance, ever resourceful, used the catacombs as well. Beneath enemy-controlled Paris, they moved through these tunnels with expert knowledge, staging ambushes, smuggling weapons, and conducting meetings in the echoing darkness. It was an underground game of cat and mouse. The cataphiles of the time, who were already familiar with the unofficial sections, became invaluable. Their knowledge of hidden entrances and obscure routes turned the catacombs into a guerrilla labyrinth. Where there are bones and darkness, there are myths. The catacombs are fertile ground for ghost stories and urban legends. One of the most famous is about the ghost of the catacombs, said to be a long-lost quarryman. Others tell of a videotape found in the early 1990s, recording the last moments of a man wandering alone, growing increasingly panicked, before dropping the camera and disappearing forever. This story has become a modern urban legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the maze. The legacy, an empire of the dead for the living. Today, the Paris catacombs are one of the city's strangest and most visited attractions. Each year, hundreds of thousands descend into this empire of the dead, not for a funeral or a ceremony, but for curiosity, for a selfie with a skull, for the chilling thrill of standing among 6 million people who once lived. The catacombs remain controversial. Critics argue that turning mass graves into a tourist attraction is disrespectful, reducing human lives to decorations. Yet, the catacombs still serve a powerful purpose. They remind us of scale, of the sheer number of lives that came before us. They are, quite literally, the foundation of Paris, the dead holding up the living. But perhaps the most profound impact of the catacombs occurs the moment you climb the stairs and return to the surface. Paris suddenly feels different, louder, brighter, more alive. In the end, the catacombs do not celebrate death. They sharpen our sense of life, of its fragility, brevity, and beauty. Beneath Paris lies its deepest truth. Everything we build on bone. And one day, perhaps, the city will add our bones to that archive.